Diversity is something that I've always been in love with because when I was in college, I was an English and classics kind of double major because I couldn't decide, which one to go for. And when I heard about comparative literature, my last year at Georgetown, I thought, this is perfect. It's a study of different cultures, and it's about putting things together. So I've written crazy pieces like comparing Wallace Stevens to Petrarch and, Dante with Joyce and so on. And that's what I just think is the most interesting thing, is when you juxtapose two things or three things rather than focusing on one thing. And that's one of the things the academic world annoyed me about sometimes until I discovered comparative literature and took that degree at Yale and then ended up teaching that. And I think that the rest of my life has been an extension of working in more than one discipline. I mean, in addition to movies, I'm very involved in books. I've just finished another book of my own, and I publish books because 4 years ago I realized that I was having a hard time after selling books to New York for 20 years or more and having nearly 20 New York Times bestsellers. I realized that because of all the conglomeration that was going on among the publishers purchased by large corporations around the world, there was no longer much chance for a young new voice to be published. What they're looking for is established brands. And, the old joke that Stephen King could publish, the phone book with his name on it. And that's just the way it is in this, huge country where marketing and branding is what it's all about to get the attention of this 300 million audience. So I came up with the idea, and what was happening to me is because I couldn't publish things as easily as I could before. I published 250 books, sold them to publishers, and I could take those books to Hollywood and sell them to Hollywood. So I no longer had books to take to Hollywood. So I decided to start my own imprint, Story Merchant Books, which I did. And that was, 5 years ago, and we've published over 200 books now. And I now take them to Hollywood and set them up as series or set them up as movies. And no one seems to mind that they're not Random House books. They don't even look at the publisher, basically. They listen to me pitch the story at lunch, and then they take the book home and read it. And so I've always been involved in, it's sort of like comparative situation because I've got New York publishing and Hollywood, and I've used them back and forth against each other. One time, because Hollywood has this huge respect for books, and New York has this awe of movies, primarily because of the marketing money associated with movies that they can then ride along with when they republish the book. So I'm hoping to have a big auction coming up soon on a movie that's appearing this summer after 22 years, called The Meg from Warner Brothers. And we sold it 22 years ago. That's how long it's been. We developed it through one of my companies and then sold it to the publisher, and then we sold it to a studio, and it's been 22 years in development hell until finally it's getting made. And one of the good things about stories is that they're timeless. One of my favorite examples of which was no solace to its author, Herman Melville, is that Moby Dick sold about 60 copies prior to Melville's death. And within 2 decades after his death, it became not only an international bestseller, but the great American novel. So the stories are timeless, and that's what writers are capable of doing, of creating something timeless, which is of immense value, obviously, to the human race. The Iliad and the Odyssey were composed thousands of years ago, and yet they're still on every bookstore's shelves. You can find them all over the internet. And so the power of stories, I've always loved the fact that a story grows up can be a book, or same story can grow up and be a movie. We once had a screenplay that I loved that won the Nichols Award, one of the highest, awards in the business, and it was placed almost at the top, not quite at the top. But I read it, loved it, tried to sell it to the studios. They all thought it was too original. They didn't know who the author was, and they ended up passing. So I told the author, let's turn this story into a book. And so, long story short, we did. And I sold it to a major publisher. And within a couple of weeks of selling to a major publisher, we had an auction in Hollywood and sold it to a major studio. And it went into development. And we've done it kind of the opposite way. As somebody was starting to write a project in one form, and I told him to write it in the other because of a random conversation I had with an editor. And she thought it sounded like the best novel she'd ever heard. And he wasn't a novelist, but long story short, within 3 months, he wrote a novel and we sold it, and then sold it for $1.2 million to, a major studio in Hollywood. So I thought, that's my comparative literature background, that the idea of having two different worlds to put together and recognize how you're related to each other. I learned that there are wormholes between New York and LA because when I was just beginning to shop the novel in the second case to New York, I sent it to only one publisher, which is the person that told me it sounded like a great idea. She didn't know I only sent it to her, but I sent it to her alone. And 3 days later, I got a call from George Clooney's partner asking if he could option it. And I said, how did you hear about that? And he said, I can't tell you. And I said, well, if you can't tell me, do you want to read it? I mean, what do you want to do? And he goes, no, we've read it already, and we want to make an offer on it. So that began an auction for that property too. But I learned that there was a wormhole going on because I called the editor and fished around talking to her, and she denied that anyone had ever read it outside of her office, which couldn't have been true because clearly someone had read it. It got snuck out through the wormhole. So I thought I could only have done this if I had the whole mentality that I will not find my niche and only be working in films. I will not only work in books. I want to work in both. I love them both. And they're just two different forms of storytelling. And why can't any story that's dramatic end up in both camps? And that's kind of what I've done throughout my career, is tried to get a story for both camps.
It's funny too, because I would think that the entrance into the literary world, the New York literary world, is much more based on, pedigree and different, whereas Hollywood, you've got a great script, anything goes, you're in the front door if they like it. So it sounds like that's not always the case. That sounds like that's my perception of it. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, that's without offending you, it's an old-fashioned perception.
It's okay.
It's kind of an all-American old 50s, 1950s.
Yeah, before I was born, yeah.
Because you can have a great script and get nowhere in Hollywood. It's getting it to the right person that matters. And even with a great script, as that one was where I talked the guy into writing the book and then sold it to, in an auction too, he had a great script. And he was able to get it to people, but they didn't buy it because they were afraid. Because what's happened in the last 20 years is that Hollywood and New York have become corporatized. They've all been acquired by international conglomerates. There isn't a single studio that isn't owned by some foreign, accumulation, with the exception of Disney, which of course is itself an international conglomerate. Right, but Sony owns Columbia, and Paramount is owned by CBS, Viacom. So because of that, the executives have totally changed from a world in which, and the same is true in publishing, from a world in which people with guts and vision made decisions about doing a story, publishing it, or greenlighting a movie. Now it's corporate people wearing suits who are very worried for their jobs. Whose I always say their main focus is on their gold cards and their Mercedes, and they don't want to do anything to jeopardize that. Whereas the heads of studios in the old days would just take chances. This is a great story. I love it. I'm gonna do this story, and but now they can't. They have to show marketing reports, and this is true in New York just as well, because Hachette has bought, the Warner Books and CBS owns Simon and Schuster and Touchstone and all of those things. Every one of the big companies, Holt Springs owns Macmillan and Thomas Dunn Books and Tor Books and St. Martin's Press and, Penguin Random House, Doubleday. They're all part of one huge foreign conglomerate, Bertelsmann and so on. So because of that, everyone has to think like corporate employees. They have to provide marketing P&Ls, to the editorial department and the marketing department. And the marketing department has the last say, not the editorial department. If they go, how do you know we're going to sell 100,000 copies of this book? Well, I just have a gut feeling. Well, sorry, your track record doesn't justify your having a gut feeling. So they'll let a really talented, brilliant editor make a couple of decisions like that a year. But if she doesn't prove it out by those books becoming bestsellers, she gets less leash every year. And the same is true in Hollywood. And the studios have gotten even worse because they're focused now entirely on brands. And in the last 6 years or so, they are now doing a fraction of the number of movies they used to do because they'd rather spend $200 million on a brand or than take a $50 million chance on a great story that has no track record. That's why Twilight got kicked out of Paramount, because it was sitting there, in development hell for several years, and Paramount didn't get it, and they didn't understand why it was going to be great. Summit came along and bought it from Paramount and cashed out on it, and Paramount goes, oh, okay, well, they didn't have any regrets because there's no they there. No one sits around wringing hands. They're all doing understandable logic, and no one lost their job over it. That's the important part. Whereas if you greenlight a movie and it goes down the tubes, you could lose your job. Then you're out shopping for a new Mercedes.
You're leasing one, yeah.
Yeah, at another place. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what's happened to the world. But in the meantime, the need for stories continues, and storytellers are still hugely in demand. You just have to find a new path each time. That's why I started, the imprint, so I could get around that issue. And now I just take to New York big brands, like something with the word Kennedy on it or the word Dracula. I can sell those still, but I know I can't sell smaller books. I'll try sometimes because I love the book so much, but invariably it comes down to better publish this ourselves.